Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty fundamental, and it's something that, I think we kind of take for granted sometimes.
Hmm.
Propositions, right?
Yes.
We're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on this, and we're going to try to really figure out, like, what are they?
Yeah.
Because they seem to be, like, the primary bearers of truth and falsity, the objects of belief and other attitudes like doubt, the things that clauses and sentences are referring to, and even like the meanings of sentences themselves.
Yeah. It's a real grab bag of things that we want propositions to do.
Yeah.
David Lewis, the philosopher, once said, he referred to it as this jumble of conflicting desiderata.
Right.
Because, like, can one thing really do all those things?
Right, right.
I mean, be the thing that you believe and also, like, what a sentence means.
Yeah. How
Uh,
can one thing be all those things?
Right. So that's the puzzle that we're up against.
Okay, so just to get us started, the SAPI gives us a working definition. So we're going to consider propositions as like the shareable objects of attitudes, like belief and doubt,
Right.
and also the primary bearers of truth and falsity. So this kind of lets us rule out some things right away.
Okay.
So like, my fleeting thought about coffee.
Right.
That's not really a proposition in this sense because I can't really share that with you.
Okay.
And also, like, the actual feeling of being cold isn't true or false.
Right. Yeah.
It's just a feeling.
Yeah.
So it's out, too.
Okay, so that gives us a starting point, like thinking about shareability and truth and falsity.
Right.
But then there's some even deeper questions we have to answer once we've got that sort of working definition.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if these are things that we can share and that they can be true or false, regardless of whether we think about them,
Right.
does that mean that they exist independently of our minds?
Right.
Are they abstract?
Yeah.
And how do we tell one proposition from another?
Yeah.
And what's the relationship between, like, these abstract things and the world,
Yeah.
the concrete world, which they seem to be describing somehow?
Yeah.
So there's some really deep questions here.
Yeah, and I think one thing that the SEP does really nicely is it kind of takes us on a bit of a historical tour.
Right.
So it's interesting to note that, like, the idea of a proposition, as we understand it now, it wasn't really explicitly there for someone like Plato.
Yeah.
He was dealing with related ideas, like when he was thinking about falsehood, for example, in the Theaetetus, he was more worried about, like, how can a false thought even have an object? Like,
Right.
like if I think that that Theaetetus is flying, what am I actually thinking about? So his focus was more on, like, false statements
Yeah.
than on, like, this sort of separate shareable content of belief.
I think, yeah, when you look back at Plato and Aristotle, the idea that we're talking about here, like a proposition, this distinct entity that's the object of belief, it's not clear that they would have said, yeah, that's what we're thinking about. They might have thought of thought as more like individual occurrences in someone's mind,
Right.
not something you could share.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the same with Aristotle, right? So,
Mhm.
he talks about truth and falsity in terms of, combining and separating things in thought and speech.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's not really clear that he thought of there being a separate thing, right?
Yeah.
That was true or false beyond just the individual instance of thinking. He might have, but it's hard to say for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so but then the set points out that, like, the Stoics back in, like, the 3rd century BC,
Oh, yeah?
they had something pretty close to what we're talking about.
Okay.
So they distinguished between the physical words, like the sounds and the ink on the page,
Mhm.
and what they called lecta, which means, like, what is said.
Okay.
And they divided lecta into complete ones, like whole sentence meanings, and incomplete ones, which were like the meanings of predicates.
Yeah.
And the important thing here is that among these complete lecta were axiomata,
Okay.
which were the meanings of declarative sentences, which they thought were the things that were actually true or false. And this is where it gets really interesting, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because, like, these lecta were supposed to be incorporeal,
Right.
like, not physical. So this posed a real challenge for the Stoics because they were materialists.
Right.
So they thought everything that exists is ultimately physical.
Yeah. So how do you have these incorporeal meanings?
Right.
How can they be real if everything real is physical?
Yeah. Like Seneca gave this great example. He was talking about seeing Cato walking
Mm-hmm.
and then saying, Cato is walking. So that statement isn't like a physical object,
Yeah.
but it seems like it's true or false. So how does this kind of incorporeal meaning
Right.
relate to the actual material world? It's a puzzle.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. Okay. So then we move on to the medieval period. And, the Sepp talks about Abelard, who made this distinction between what he called dicta, which means what is said, and the actual acts of thinking or asserting something.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought these dicta were the primary truth bearers. But the thing is, he didn't really fully say what they were.
Right.
So this led to a bunch of debates among the people who followed him about whether dicta were just like individual thoughts or actual events or maybe even like universals.
Right.
And then across the channel, the English scholastics were dealing with really similar questions.
Yeah.
So Adam Wadham, for example, he argued that what we assent to when we believe something, it's not a mental thing,
Right.
and it's also not a concrete thing. It's what he called a being the case.
Okay.
So like a certain state of affairs holding. And it's important to point out here, as the Sepp does, that the term propositio back then,
Mm-hmm.
it usually referred to the actual sentences, whether, in your mind or spoken out loud. While what we're calling propositions today was, what those propositions signified. It's subtle, but it matters when you're trying to understand the history.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, then we get to the early modern period, and specifically the British empiricists. And we don't see a ton of explicit talk about propositions.
They weren't so focused on this idea.
Right, right. But the Seppi does bring up Leibniz, who talked about cogitato possibilis, which means possible thoughts.
Okay.
And these had some propositional characteristics. They were like thought contents, and they were supposed to be the fundamental truth bearers.
Mm-hmm.
But their exact ontological status is still kind of up for debate,
Right. Yeah.
Okay, and then in the 19th century, we see this resurgence of propositionalism.
Yeah, it really comes back with a vengeance.
Yeah. And the CP highlights Bolzano and Frege as key figures here.
Absolutely.
So Bolzano, he proposed these setzes and six, which means like sentences in themselves. And he said that these were mind-independent, abstract things, and they were the fundamental bearers of truth and falsity.
Okay.
They weren't part of language, and they weren't part of mental states.
Right.
They were something else entirely.
Yeah.
And his main point was that when we do science, what we're trying to do is uncover these objective truths. So that was Bolzano.
Yeah, and then Frege, whose work has been so influential in contemporary philosophy, he makes this famous distinction between sense and reference, sin and beduton.
Yeah.
And so he said that for a declarative sentence, the reference is the truth value, like true or false.
Yeah.
But the sense is the thought that the sentence expresses. And crucially, he thought of these thoughts as propositions, as this shareable content.
Yeah.
And he even thought that they belonged to this special third realm of abstract, eternal entities that we can somehow grasp.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is like a really strong form of Platonism.
Okay, so then after Frege, we have Russell and Moore. In their early work, they both endorsed the idea of propositions, too.
Right.
But they had different views about what propositions are made up of.
Mm-hmm.
So Russell thought they were complexes of concrete objects,
Okay.
while Moore thought they were made up of Platonic universals. But interestingly, the Sepp points out that both of them became skeptical of propositions later on.
Yeah, it's interesting how that happened, right?
Yeah.
They start out thinking, propositions, that's the way to go.
Yeah.
And then they sort of move away from that.
Right.
In Russell's case, it seems like he was really worried about how to explain falsehood without bringing minds back into the picture.
Yeah.
And that led him to propose things like the multiple relation theory of judgment, where instead of having a two-place relation between a subject and a proposition, you'd have this multi-place relation between the subject and all these other things that make up what would have been the proposition.
Right.
The idea was to avoid having to say there's a false proposition.
Okay, so we've seen how this concept of propositions has evolved over time. Now let's look at some of the philosophical arguments for propositions. One that the SSP discusses that seems very intuitive to me is what they call the Metaphysics 101 argument.
Okay.
And it's basically this. When I believe something, like that Paris is the capital of France, there's a difference between my believing
Right.
and what I believe, right?
Yeah, totally.
And the thing that I believe, what I believe, is something that you could also believe.
Mhm.
And it's either true or false. So the argument says this what? that I believe, that we can both believe, that's true or false, that must be a proposition.
Right.
And what's cool about this argument is that it doesn't seem to depend on any particular language.
Yeah, it seems to hold across languages. It's like a basic intuition about how belief works, like what we believe,
Yeah.
the content of our beliefs.
Yeah.
That's something that can be shared and that has a truth value.
Right. But of course, intuition is only a starting point in philosophy. And the SP also looks at some linguistic challenges to propositionalism.
Okay.
And the main one they focus on is something called the relational analysis. And this is the view that that when we say things like S believes that P or that P is true,
Mm-hmm.
that clauses are referring to propositions.
Okay.
And this is where the problems start,
Right.
right?
So if those that clauses really are designating propositions,
Yeah.
then we should be able to substitute a noun phrase like the proposition that P for that P
Yeah.
without changing the truth value of the sentence.
Right.
But as we know, that doesn't always work.
Yeah, like what's a good example?
Well, think about I insist that it will snow
Okay.
versus I insist the proposition that it will snow.
Yeah, that sounds weird.
Right. They don't mean the same thing.
No, they don't.
And the second one, it sounds kind of ungrammatical.
Yeah.
It does.
So that's a problem.
Okay, so that's the substitution process.
Okay.
Right. And then there's also something called the objectivization effect, which is closely related.
Okay. What's that?
So sometimes when you substitute the proposition that P for that P,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like you change the meaning of the verb, like you force it to have a different kind of object.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, if I say, I imagine that it will snow,
Okay.
that suggests I'm having this mental image, right, this scenario.
Right.
But if I say, I imagine the proposition that it will snow,
Okay.
it sounds like I'm imagining some object.
Yeah, like an actual thing.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like the verb imagine is shifting from being about a mental content to being about an object.
Right.
And that's weird, right? That suggests that maybe that clause isn't really picking out an object after all.
Okay, so those are some pretty serious challenges. How do propositionalists respond to them?
Right. Well, the SP outlines a few strategies that they use. One common one is to say, look, similar kinds of substitution failures happen with other semantic entities too, like facts and properties and events. So maybe this isn't really a problem specifically for propositions. Maybe it's just a general problem about how language works.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
And another common defense is to point out that for lots of attitude verbs, like believe, assert, and deny,
Mm-hmm.
we can make this inference. So if S believes that P, then we can infer that S believes the proposition that P. So they say that shows there is a connection between the verb and a propositional object.
Okay, so they're saying that the relational analysis isn't totally off base because those inferences seem to work for a lot of verbs.
Exactly.
Okay, but are there like totally different ways to deal with these linguistic problems?
Yeah, there are some more radical approaches.
Okay.
So one of them is called the syntax response, and it's defended by Jeffrey King. His basic idea is that certain verbs just can't take noun phrases as complements,
Okay.
and that clauses aren't really noun phrases at all.
Right, right.
So that explains why some of those substitutions don't work. And he also says that the shift in meaning we were talking about, the objectivization effect, it's because of the different syntactic categories of the complements.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So it's all about syntax, the structure of the sentence.
Yeah, okay. And are there like semantic responses to these problems too?
Yeah, definitely. So one is to say that clauses are actually ambiguous.
Oh, okay.
They might refer to different kinds of things depending on the verb they go with.
So like sometimes a fact,
Yeah,
sometimes a proposition.
exactly. But the SEP-P points out that this view has a problem because sometimes those nominal substitutions, they just sound bad no matter what kind of thing that clause is supposed to be picking out.
Okay, so ambiguity doesn't always explain it.
Right.
Okay, anything else on the semantic side?
Yeah, Jacob Noble has this really interesting idea.
Okay.
He says that clauses do designate propositions,
Okay.
but phrases like the proposition that P actually denotes something called propositional concepts.
Propositional concepts.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. But think of them like functions
Mhm.
that map situations to propositions.
Right.
So the idea is to explain, how we can have these propositions about particular things in the world, but also have propositions that are true no matter what the world is like.
Right, right.
But of course, there are criticisms of Nobel's account, too.
Yeah, I bet. Are these problems we've been talking about, like substitution and objectivization, are those just limited to the relational analysis?
That's a good question. And the SEP actually points out that even verbs that seem really close in meaning
Right.
can act differently when it comes to substitution.
Oh, interesting.
So it seems like this shift in verb meaning, this objectivization effect, might be a broader thing in language that we need to figure out, no matter what our theory of propositions is.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we've seen some of the problems with the standard relational analysis.
Right.
What are some of the alternative frameworks that people have come up with?
Well, one option is to just deny that attitude verbs, when they have those that clauses after them, designate relations to propositions at all.
Oh, okay.
And so you're basically saying that believing isn't a relation to a proposition.
Right, right.
It's something else entirely.
Okay, and what else?
Another idea is to revive Russell's multiple relation theory,
Right.
where that clause gives you the constituents of this multiplace attitude relation,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't have a single unified proposition as the object.
Okay.
And then there's also the idea that those that clauses might be predicates.
Predicates, okay.
So they're specifying the content of attitudes that are denoted by nouns.
Okay, that's interesting.
And then there's also this prenective view, which is inspired by work in tense logic, where the attitude verbs act like a kind of connective between the subject and the embedded sentence,
Right.
without you needing to have a proposition as a separate thing.
Okay, so lots of different ways to think about how these sentences work.
Absolutely. It's a really active area of research in philosophy of language.
Okay, so earlier we were talking about that Metaphysics 101 argument.
Right. The one that seems so intuitive.
Yeah, yeah. And the set makes this really interesting point, which is that we need to think about just how deep that argument really is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it really telling us something profound about the nature of reality?
Yeah.
Or is it something more superficial?
Right. And to help us think about that, the set brings up Carnap's distinction between internal questions, which are answered within a specific linguistic framework,
All right.
and external questions, which try to step outside of all frameworks.
Okay.
So Carnap thought that the existence of propositions might be a trivially true internal question
Okay.
within a certain way of speaking,
Right.
but that the external metaphysical question is meaningless
Right, right.
because it doesn't have any real content. It's like
Yeah.
asking whether the number 7 is made of cheese.
Yeah, yeah.
It just doesn't make sense. But of course, there are challenges to Carnap's view, too.
Okay, like what?
Well, one problem is, how do we account for the truth of those internal statements?
Mm-hmm.
If there are propositions, is true within a framework
Right.
what makes it true?
Yeah.
So maybe the Metaphysics 101 argument, even though it seems kind of trivial, is still pointing to a real ontological issue.
Okay, so if Carnap's view is problematic, are there other ways to explain why that Metaphysics 101 argument seems so compelling
Right.
without having to commit to a whole ontology of propositions?
Yeah, there are. So one approach is fictionalism. The idea here is that maybe talking about propositions is just a useful fiction.
Okay.
It's a convenient way to talk about beliefs and truth and things like that.
Right.
But we don't have to actually believe that propositions exist. Yablow's idea of figuralism is discussed here,
Mm-hmm.
which says that we might just be pretending there are propositions
Yeah.
in order to communicate certain kinds of information.
Okay, so it's like a useful tool, but not a real thing.
Right.
Okay, anything else?
Another neo-Carnapian idea is that maybe quantifiers, like there is and for all,
Right.
have different readings. There might be a domain conditions reading, which does have ontological commitments, and then an inferential role reading, which doesn't.
Okay, so with the first reading, when you say there is, you're saying there really exists something.
Exactly.
But with the second reading, you're just saying something about what you can infer.
Right.
Okay.
And Hofweber argues that the Metaphysics 101 argument might seem compelling because it's subtly shifting between these two readings.
Oh, interesting.
So it looks like it's making a deep ontological point,
Right.
but actually it's just talking about inference.
Okay, I see. So we've talked about the arguments for propositions, and we've looked at some of the linguistic challenges. What about the nature of propositions themselves? Like, what are they?
Yeah, good question. So the CEPI-OP talks about these easy arguments for the mind independence and abstractness of propositions. And the basic idea is that some propositions, like there are rocks or 2 + 2 = 4,
Mm-hmm.
they don't seem to logically require any minds or concrete objects to be true.
Right.
So it seems like they could exist even if there weren't any minds or rocks.
Right, that makes sense. But doesn't that lead us to Platonism?
Exactly. And that's what the CEPI points out. These seemingly easy arguments can lead to some pretty strong philosophical commitments,
Yeah.
like the view that there are these mind-independent abstract entities.
Right. And then we run into those pesky Ben Esaraf problems.
Oh, yeah, those are always fun.
Right, which say, how can we even know about these abstract things if we can't causally interact with them?
Mm,
And how do we tell one proposition from another when there might be multiple candidates that look the same?
right.
Okay, so how do people respond to these easy arguments?
Well, one important distinction that comes up is between truth in a world and truth at a world.
Okay, I think I remember this from logic class. So truth in a world means that the truth bearer actually exists in that world and is true there.
Right.
But truth at a world just means that the truth bearer accurately describes that world, whether or not it exists in that world.
Exactly. And conceptualists, for example,
Right.
they might use this distinction to say that propositions can be true at worlds without minds or concrete objects,
Right.
without having to exist as mind-independent things in those worlds.
Right, because they're just about how concepts are related.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's one way to push back against those easy arguments.
And then there's also deflationism, which is a whole other approach to propositions.
Okay, tell me about that.
So in particular, the TEPOP discusses Schiffer's idea of pleonastic propositions.
Pleonastic propositions.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. But basically, the idea is that propositions are tied to our linguistic and conceptual practices. They don't exist out there independently of us.
Right.
And he says that they're kind of an ontological free lunch.
Ontological free lunch. I like the sound of that.
Right. It's like we get them for free
Yeah.
because they just arise from these true something from nothing transformations that don't actually add any new content to our language.
Okay, so it's like they're just a way of talking, but they don't really commit us to anything extra.
Right.
Okay. But even with this view, the SEP raises some tough questions. Like, why should the fact that something doesn't interfere with our language mean that it exists? And how do we explain truth conditions if propositions are just pleonastic?
Right. Good questions.
Okay, so are there any other major views on the nature of propositions?
Yeah, one final one that the SEPI discusses is the idea that propositions are types of mental or linguistic acts.
Types of acts, okay.
Yeah, so this view is defended by thinkers like Dummett, Hanks, and Soames.
Okay.
And it's a way of trying to address those Platonist challenges about how we can know or represent these abstract entities
Right.
by grounding representational properties in the concrete tokens of thinking or speaking.
Okay, so instead of propositions being these separate things,
Yeah.
they're just like ways that we think or talk.
Right, exactly. But this view faces some challenges too, like what about propositions that have never been thought or expressed? How do we account for their truth conditions?
Right, those missing propositions.
Exactly. And this sometimes leads to a kind of Platonism about types or a rejection of actualism, the view that only actual things exist.
Right.
And some critics argue that this view doesn't really explain representation at all. It just pushes the problem back a step.
So we still have that puzzle of how thought and language connect to the world.
Exactly.
Okay, now, before we wrap up, we need to at least touch on the problem of individuation.
Yes, this is a crucial one.
Right. How do we tell one proposition from another? What are the criteria for identity? The SEC notes that Quine has long been concerned about the lack of clear identity conditions for propositions.
He was really worried about this.
And it brings up the distinction between structured and unstructured propositions.
Right. So structured propositions have constituents in an order,
Okay.
and unstructured propositions don't.
Right, like maybe they're just sets of possible worlds.
Exactly. But then structured views face the problem of the unity of the proposition.
Right, like how do those constituents come together to form a single, meaningful whole?
Yeah. And unstructured views have their own problems too. Like,
Yeah.
how do you distinguish between propositions that seem different but are true in all the same possible worlds?
Right, that's the problem of granularity.
Exactly. And then there are algebraic approaches which try to build up propositions from more basic elements.
Okay.
But they still have trouble distinguishing between coreferential terms. Like, how do you tell the difference between Clark Kent flies and Superman flies if they both refer to the same guy?
Right. So lots of tricky issues there.
Yeah, individuation is a really thorny problem. And then there's also the question of how propositions relate to facts and states of affairs.
Okay, yeah, that's another big one. So what's the SEP say about that?
Well, it points out that there are good reasons to think that facts aren't just true propositions.
Okay.
And it suggests that maybe facts are concretizations of true propositions.
Okay.
Like the way a statue is a concretization of the sculptor's idea.
Right. And then all those linguistic arguments about substitution failures come back here, too.
Right.
And we also get the concept of bipolar facts, which are possible states of affairs. And there's a debate about whether states of affairs are a type of proposition themselves.
Yeah, it's all very interconnected.
Right. And then there's King's view that all propositions are really just facts about semantic values and syntactic relations.
Right, so it all comes back to language in the end.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
And I think what's become clear is that our understanding of propositions is tied up with all these other big philosophical questions about meaning and truth and belief and even metaphysics.
Yeah. It's like if you pull on this one thread, this idea of a proposition, you end up unraveling this whole tapestry of philosophical issues.
Right, right. It's amazing how even this seemingly simple question, what is it that we believe, leads to all these incredibly complex and fascinating debates.
It really shows you how much depth there is to our most basic cognitive and linguistic activities. And as the essay Petrie shows, there's really no easy answer here.